Victoria Kirilloff is a certified divorce financial analyst and is certified in mediation. She is the founder of Divorce Analytics. Her firm is dedicated to making the financial side of divorce transparent and productive. By focusing on financial facts, she transforms divorce from a destructive process into one of empowerment. Victoria's own experience divorcing a high conflict husband after a 10-year relationship that had turned toxic led her to this work. To find her way out of the marriage, she leveraged her background in financial analysis, creating the first global settlement proposal and divorce report. This helped Victoria and her partner reach a peaceful separation, sparking an idea. Victoria could help others navigate divorce with financial clarity and empowerment. Welcome, Victoria.
Thank you so much for having me, Tracy.
This is going to be such an interesting conversation. I know that numbers are so intimidating to so many people, but I am a firm believer that knowledge is power. And in the divorce process, women get shortchanged unless they come to the table with lots of knowledge about exactly what's been going on with their money, right?
You got that right.
Okay, so I want to start off hearing more about your personal divorce story and how it brought you to this work that you do with divorce analytics. Again, because the money stuff is so scary, but you have actually lived this, and I want to hear more.
So, I really am standing on the shoulders of my father. And to really understand where I got my report writing career started is really going back to when I was 8 years old and I was begging my parents for a pony. My dad was a brilliant Russian engineer that had invented a type of train brake by the time I was born. And so it was just kind of like family expectation that I was going to be moving into the family's business. And so my dad was very much so a numerical communicator, being able to bridge the gap between his highly, gifted but super conflicted engineers, his bottom line driven executives, and his clients that had challenging needs. So he was making deals with all of these people by focusing on the hard documentation. So when I started to beg him for a horse, he thought that this was going to be the best opportunity to teach me how to do a life cycle cost analysis. So I gathered all of the information, typed up my report, and I realized that my mom had me in like all of these different activities. And with the horse, I was no longer, hopefully, going to have the time for all of these different things. So we could actually reallocate my ballet money to the horse. And yeah, it was still going to cost something, but it wasn't going to be as expensive. So I was able to make a numerical argument to my parents, and my father, in his infinite wisdom, decided to teach me a wonderful life lesson. And Buster was purchased not too long after. So, fast forward to my relationship with Voldemort. He was my college sweetheart. He was a brilliant engineer in his own right. Very much so like Voldemort, though. He started off a nerdy Tom Riddle, and it was through the life challenges that I got to see his other side. And it wasn't so great. It was very much so that Death Eater. And he had this beautiful mask that he would wear when he had to perform and he was wanting to be charismatic, but behind closed doors, he was a totally different guy. And I thought very wrongly that if I just loved him enough, if I tried hard enough, if I made enough money, he would come around and we could have this great life together. Well, that wasn't true. And there was a horrible domestic violence incident where he was choking me, demanding that I apologize. And there was kind of like an out of body experience where I realized that my analytical side kicked in. And it was like, okay, this guy is choking you and demanding an apology. There's no way that these two things go at once together. And it kind of jogged me out of whatever delusional state that I was in. And I realized he was very sick. But now I needed to get myself out. And unfortunately, my father had suffered a catastrophic stroke not too long before. So this was the first major life event I had been facing without my big Papa Bear in the room. So I went back to what he taught me. And one of his favorite sayings was, if it cannot be expressed in numbers, it cannot be expressed at all. So I fired up my computer and I started building out what ended up becoming the first global settlement proposal. I began with her cash flow. Like many Americans, I was really hooked on consumption, but especially as my relationship was ending, I realized I was going to Starbucks 4 or 5 times a day. And yeah, I liked the caffeine, but it was really because, unfortunately, that was like the only positive human interaction I had with anyone. So I had to come to terms with the hard financial and economic coping mechanisms I was engaging in while this relationship was ending. So it was only after I put pen to paper and really understood the cash flow that I realized, as much as I loved our house, I had a young financial services business and I didn't want to be tied to yard work every single weekend. So I developed two different property division proposals, laying out what it would take for him to buy me out of the house and what it would be if we sold everything and then split all of the rest of our assets. And being my father's daughter, I backstopped that entire report with documentation, understanding that engineers, especially, they might not value what you say, but they'll value the documentation that it's built on. And we were able really to have like the most productive conversation that was incredibly empowering because it was all financial based. There was no emotions involved. There was no discussion of who he was doing or who he was screwing the night before. It was strictly, this is the financial operations of us being two separate entities. And well, he definitely wasn't appreciating the position he put himself in. He also understood that this was the best deal he was ever going to get, being able to kind of game things out from a mathematical standpoint. The cost of litigation was going to be pretty great. So if we could create a win win outcome, it was the best way to go for both of us. And that essentially was the beginning of my business. Here we are 8 years later.
Okay, so that leads me to a question because you mentioned the outcome. But my experience with narcissists is they have to feel like they win and you lose. So if it really was a win win, how did you get him to agree to this?
I think it always goes back to what your motivations are. And really, with a narcissist, their motivations are pretty much self serving. They want to preserve their image, they want to feel like, they got something over on you. And, most personalities that are disordered have some level of like antagonism that's developed within it. And so there's ways for you to meet those needs while also getting what you want out of the divorce. I think a common analogy I like to use is that two kids are fighting over the orange. And you think, well, if I just divide it in half, both of them would be happy. Well, not true. If you actually take a step back and ask the kids, what do you want? You find one kid wants the peel and the other one wants the actual meat on the inside. So it really takes, I think, you need to drill down into that person's motivations because they're probably not like your own. And you just need to find a way, especially when you begin negotiating with them, give them some wins, right? And you have to be very strategic in how you actually plan everything out. It's not just a, throw them the report and call it good. It worked, Voldemort and I also have a little bit different of a background. My father, before he became a train break inventor, he worked for the CIA. And so I had a much different psychological operational training as a child than I would assume most people did.
Okay, narcissists thrive on power and control. So, how do they get their power in the divorce process?
By delaying, I would say. I mean, that is the number one thing that I see narcissists do. I can't tell you how many of my clients, they have been going through the divorce process for 2 years. Their attorney took a soft hands approach in the initial stages. They said, "Hey, let's do an informal discovery. Let's try to save you some money." Well, when you're dealing with a narcissist, that is the wrong way to go. You need to create consequences that are outside of you, especially. And so, doing that formal discovery, having hard deadlines, if they don't comply, then the court has options to give them sanctions. Unfortunately, though, there is no divorce police that comes out and bops them on the nose. You do have to then pay your attorney to hold them accountable. So it's really important, as you are going throughout this process, to really understand your the person you're dealing with, your partner's shortcomings, and how you can build your divorce team to be understanding of how the narcissist works, so you don't get a well-meaning attorney but doesn't understand the narcissistic personality, and inadvertently they become triangulated and add more to your pain.
I think that concept of holding them accountable is really important. What I see in divorces with narcissists is, the first time you try to hold them accountable and have a consequence for them not complying or not doing what they're supposed to do, there is often a big explosion. But the more you keep holding them accountable and the more they realize that there are going to be consequences, I've seen them become more compliant with the process.
Yeah, well, they're not used to anyone actually standing up to them, and oftentimes, especially if you're like me, you try to hold them accountable during your marriage, but they don't respect you. And so you have to be very mindful with how you're creating your divorce team, because that person, your attorney, generally is going to be the one taking them to task. But as you mentioned, Tracy, they become remarkably compliant because honestly, I have found they don't have that much energy. Their manipulation tactics are very much so like there's only so much dark machinations you can do. If you're not actually building relationships based off of goodwill, um, you're kind of you only have a certain number of tools in your tool belt, and once those have been spent, there's just
Right.
nothing left.
Right. Now, I know the idea of trying to take control of this divorce process and take some power back is probably pretty scary, especially if you've been a victim of your spouse for years. But why is it important that we do take back control when we're dealing with that high conflict person?
Well, no one is going to advocate for you in your divorce unless you are. And I think a common misbelief a lot of people have is that they keep waiting for their attorney to develop a global settlement proposal. And I think you have to keep in mind, attorney's role is to be your linguistical warrior and to guide you through the settlement process and negotiating and potentially legal filings and all that stuff. So that means you have a lot of homework to do. And if you have been the financially out spouse, it's even more overwhelming and intimidating. But it is really on your shoulders to help your divorce team understand all of the ins and outs of your marital balance sheet. And that's where working with a CDFA or a forensic accountant like you is so helpful, because you're actually able to value the whole marital estate. And then it's from that number you do your division.
So, you mentioned gaslighting, and I wanted to talk about financial gaslighting and what that is and how it presents in the divorce process.
Yeah. So I hit on it a little bit earlier, but let's drill down. So financial gaslighting occurs when you just have there's a complete disconnect between what your partner is telling you and what your financial reality is. And so where I often see this kind of come to fruition is in the spousal support calculation, where, people will often say we have no money. I don't know how we're able to really survive. And, meanwhile, they're saving, $10,000 a month and they have you on the shoestring budget. And so they then carried this belief into the divorce process, right? Where, you were surviving on, chump change during the marriage. And so that's what you should get as a result. They completely fail to take into consideration all of the different expenses that they were covering, right? And they just see you kind of as a loss leader item. So it's really important to use education and historical information to actually create what that historical marital standard of living was, so then you don't just take their narrative and run with it and then tell your whole divorce team. So I think that's often where I see a lot of gaslighting.
So, you came up with this idea, the concept of the global settlement proposal. I want to know exactly what that is and how it works.
Yeah. So each global settlement proposal is different based off of what the scope of work is. But generally, most people have a couple main issues to resolve, and then like spousal support, any type of child support. It's really important, honestly. If you are dating or married to a business owner or somebody that gets a 1099, you need to know what their total income is. This is so important because that's pretty much what spouses or child support calculations are based off of, your total income. So capturing that information is key. But then also, the global settlement proposal drills down on all of those child related costs that are not covered by the support payment. So this then enables you guys to really come up with a much better plan and deal with, how the day-to-day financial operations for your children are going to go, because sometimes that can honestly be a big problem. So the global settlement proposal then deals with the property division, factoring in, a house analysis. You have to make sure that if you are requesting the home, you can actually afford it. A big thing is checking to see if your home is assumable, that mortgage note. If not, you're going to have to go through the refinancing process. So all of these decisions go into your property division proposal. And also, if you are going after spousal support, you have to determine if it's going to be paid in a lump sum or if you're going to take a monthly payment. If you're doing a lump sum, then you have the property division proposal actually show how that could be paid. So the GSP really acts as an evidence-based report for every single member of your divorce team, as well as the opposing counsel and the judge, to really understand the financial landscape. And obviously, everything is backed with documentation. So it can all be verified.
Great. Why is the global settlement proposal kryptonite to that high conflict person?
Well, gaslighting is built off of like indigent facts, estimations and hypotheticals. Once you actually have documentation, the narcissist really has nothing else to do, right? They can't gaslight you into having an alternate reality. And, you really need that documentation to bring them back down to earth. Oftentimes they'll say, you can get by on $2,500 a month in spousal support. Well, if you actually look at their historical information, their mortgage payment is $2,500 a month. So then, the narcissist point that they did make you a spousal support offer and you just, disingenuously decided to not take it, right? Well, no, wrong. They actually didn't put their best foot forward. They created a spousal support proposal that was only designed to enrage and antagonize you. So when you have the financial facts, you really have a much better idea if that other person is actually negotiating with you in goodwill or if they're just giving you breadcrumbs and delaying the process even further.
I love the idea that because it's so fact based, they have nothing to argue with, right? They cannot, unless they try to create alternate facts, but they won't have documentation to support it. And that's why that global settlement proposal is so strong because it's so fact based. And it sounds like in your divorce from Voldemort, that's exactly the position you were in. He didn't have anything he could argue with.
Yeah, he had no room to go. I outmaneuvered him.
And that is so wonderful to hear. And it feels so empowering because as women, we're often put in a position of subservience and take what you can get in this divorce. Oh, he's offering the thing. And even if it doesn't seem fair, your attorney might be saying, well, that's probably the best you're going to get. And so to be able to step in and take the upper hand is very inspiring.
It's amazing that the most challenging time of my life actually has been the fertilizer of which my rose garden has grew on top of. And I just feel very fortunate that I was able to live that night. And here I am helping other people, get out of their bad relationships too.
Well, you have an upcoming webinar that I would love for you to tell our listeners about.
Yeah, I have a webinar on how to divorce a narcissist on June 26th. If you're not able to make that one, I have it the next July, I think, the fourth Wednesday or fourth Thursday. So we'd love to see you there.
That's wonderful. I think that people are really looking for more education. I know that divorcing a narcissist is really hard. And so understanding the tactics that they use, how you can counteract them, super important. So I know that that's going to be a really valuable webinar. Victoria, we will put a link to the webinar in the show notes so people can sign up. Thank you so much for being here and providing such wonderful education.
Thank you so much for having me, Tracy. It's been a pleasure.